I am one of those dreaded policymakers and regulators that everyone's talked about who might over-regulate micro-credentials. And I say might, but our perspective of what appropriate regulation looks like might be different to what a provider's perspective of what appropriate regulation looks like. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Irish context, but very much from the quality assurance, qualifications framework perspective. And having listened to a few of the presentations over the last couple of days, I've been thinking about how to reframe my presentation, so I'll probably place greater emphasis on certain parts and move quickly through other bits and pieces. So in terms of the Irish context, for those of you who are not familiar, QQI is a one-stop shop, quite unusual in the European context. We are the Quality Assurance Agency, we're the Qualifications Authority, and we're an awarding body in our own right. And we have some really important responsibilities, and for us it's very much about ensuring that learners achieve qualifications that are valued nationally and internationally, and we provide trusted information on those qualifications. And our national framework is in legislation, and QQI is required to maintain, develop and implement that NFQ. Interestingly, you're probably thinking she's talking about qualifications a lot, and I hear that often, even in the Irish context, but that's because that's all I can talk about. We are in the business of qualifications in QQI, and it's probably worth emphasising that the business of qualifications is quite different in the Irish context to other countries. Our NFQ is incredibly well embedded. People understand it. Learners will reference their NFQ levels when they talk about their qualifications. We talk about the taxi driver test. Taxi drivers will often tell you their son is studying a level 6, so it's really well embedded. And we also have a very, very flexible framework, which I'm going to tell you a little bit more about as well. We also host a number of European representations. We host the NARIC in Ireland in our NARIC Ireland. We're the National Europass Centre. We're the national correspondent for the Bologna process, and we're the EQF national coordination point. So we're really centralised in all things qualifications in QQI. And this is just to confirm that we receive funding to do that work, and some of the work we're doing in the micro-credential space is using some of the funding we get from the Commission. QQI launched a new strategy this year, and our tagline for that strategy and our key priority is looking after learner interests. And I think I'm more convinced that that tagline and that priority is important, because to me learners haven't come up as often as I thought they might over the last couple of days. And the reason we think looking after learner interests is a key priority is because the education and training landscape has gotten significantly more complicated in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, and every year since it is getting more and more complicated. You have to be an incredibly sophisticated learner to be able to navigate the education and training system as it stands now, and to really know what you're getting for your time, money, and effort. And for us, part of that is around information provision. The learners are incredibly clear what they're signing up for. We have no doubt that the micro-credentials being offered across providers, industry, employers are valuable learning, good quality. People are getting what they thought they'd get from a learning perspective. But what does that piece of paper mean to that learner? Did it say what they thought it would say? Did it allow them to change jobs? Did it allow them to access additional education? Did it do what it said on the tin? So that's why we're looking after learner interests. And we have committed to also review our National Framework of Qualifications, the award types, everything that's in there. And again, that's because we already have a flexible framework, but it's important to us that our national framework reflects the actual education and training landscape, not the traditional one that we know about. And I'll talk to you a little bit about our framework, which was established over 20 years ago in 2003. It's one of the earliest frameworks established. And the priority at that point was to recognise all learning. We certainly haven't achieved that ambition, but we're still very committed to that ambition. So no matter what learning learners are engaged in, it is included in our National Framework of Qualifications. It was a lofty ambition in 2003, and it's pretty lofty now as there are more and more education and training providers coming into the system. And even back in 2003, we recognised that learners would engage with learning in different ways, different volumes, at different points in their life. So it truly is a national framework of lifelong learning. And importantly for us, we've always had micro-credentials. Since the inception of the framework in 2003, we had qualifications as small as 5 ECTS. We didn't call them micro-credentials, so to us it's the term that's new, not the concept. But that doesn't mean when the concept came along, and the money came along, and the interest came along, that people didn't start doing things slightly differently to what the framework had permitted all along. So there's no real agreed definition in Ireland about what a micro-credential is, but we generally accept it as being less than 30 ECTS credits. We all have slightly different numbers, but I agree with Alexandra, you do have to come up with a number, and at least that way you can classify things. The smallest is typically around the 5 ECTS space, but we have seen smaller. Most of them are offered through our public education providers, And they're available at every level of our framework, from level 1, which would be your general literacy and numeracy qualifications, right down in your general education and your vocational education and training, up to higher education. Our vocational education and training system in Ireland has always been based on the concept of stackable small qualifications. So the very main component of vocational education in Ireland is a major award that is made up of 8 minor awards that learners do at their own pace, and often some of those minor awards allow them to enter the labour market. So sometimes you do 1 or 2 of them and you're able to get a job, work, and as you study, and then you can either stop because that's what you needed, or you continue to amass the remainder of those minors and then you get your major award, which again provides you better opportunities in the labour market and often provides you access then to higher education if that's what you're looking to do. We also have professional qualifications at micro-credentials and all other levels of the framework as well. Information provision is our real priority here, and it's about clarity to learners about what they're learning, what they're doing, and what that certification piece is going to look like. Just to give you a bit of a sense, we have about 12,000 qualifications included in the Irish National Framework of Qualifications. Over 30% of those are smaller than 30 ECTS. As you'll see, we have very small numbers in the vocational education and training space, and then they start to increase as we move into what we consider higher education. This shows the trends over the last 4 years, just to show how many new micro-credentials have been introduced in quite a short space of time. QQI, in our capacity as an awarding body, is that small blue column on the left. We are the smallest providers of micro-credentials, and we would be dealing with private providers mostly, and lots of what would be considered non-formal providers. But even when you consider that we're the smallest number, we have certified over 12,000 learners with micro-credentials in the last 10 years, with an average increase of kind of 20% every year. So that gives you a sense of how the Irish context is coping without ever defining a micro-credential, without ever having a particular award type for it. We have lots and lots of good activity in this space, all within the qualifications framework. So people are getting qualifications, they're getting NFQ levels, they're getting EQF levels, they're getting a qualification that is published on our Irish Register of Qualifications. There's lots and lots of good information provision. But we are seeing inconsistencies come in, and I suppose that's where our role as a regulator, we think having some form of regulation of micro-credentials in your national context improves your consistency, your comparability, your transparency, and ultimately it protects your learners who have better access to information about what they're doing. In terms of the broader European policy context, certainly looking at inclusive NFQs, we would consider we already have an inclusive NFQ, but we're looking to make it more inclusive. Looking at things like micro-credentials, looking at professional awards, so those are all priorities we're looking at the moment. And then really around awareness and use of NFQs. As I said, we have a really strong NFQ, people know what it is, and our concern is where people are doing things off framework. How does that fit in? Does it undermine the framework? How do you promote the framework itself, but then things that are operating outside it? And it's to say we can understand why there would be micro-credentials that aren't on a national framework, but where your national framework is very flexible and inclusive, what does that tension and what does that balance look like? And I suppose we're exploring a very different policy perspective on micro-credentials as a result. I'm not going to focus too much on the types of definitions that have been around because we've talked about it a lot, but the things we're particularly interested in is the idea that there's kind of multi-purposes for micro-credentials. There's the timely specific learning needs that are very much labour market driven versus that flexible progression towards traditional qualifications and increasing broader access to education. We started off assuming that those were kind of two separate purposes, but we find that even where someone enrolls in a standalone micro-cred, very much delivered, kind of targeted at skills needs, labour market, ultimately they then want to stack, or they want the option of stacking, or they've had the promise of stacking. So then that standalone labour market-driven micro-credential turns into flexible progression to traditional qualifications. We've talked a lot about drivers, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. But in terms of enablers, things that we think have allowed for the proliferation of micro-credentials is the modularisation of education and training, widely accepted standards of knowledge and skills, the use of learning outcomes, credit, access, transfer and progression systems, qualifications frameworks, qualifications registers, external accreditation. We think all of those things are enablers of micro-credentials. But if the micro-credentials don't sit within the ecosystem that's enabled them, what does that mean for the learner and the education and training offer? Excuse me. Trust is something that's really important to us, and it's something we've been thinking about. We think trust is really central to learners, employers, and other end users of qualifications really accepting micro-credentials. And trust is really embedded in the credibility of the provider. But we think trusted providers are leveraging that existing ecosystem of QA, of qualifications frameworks, of credit systems. So is trust limited to the provider, or is it driven by the ecosystem? And how do micro-credentials fit more into that ecosystem rather than to the provider? And can they exist without using all of those things directly? I mean, I don't need to say that I've got a vested interest in this. I am a regulator, and I live in a quality assurance qualifications framework world, but it's just where we're thinking. And it's really around how do learners and other end users of qualifications understand the difference. And that's a harder question when you live in a world where the NFQ is well embedded. So employers will often have on job ads, must have a level 8 qualification. So we're then asking them to ask for kind of upskilling and reskilling that isn't using that language or infrastructure that they know so well. And is the trust proposition different if you're looking for a standalone micro-credential or something that stacks? And then for us, learner confidence is a really key part of education and training, that learners can trust the providers, the qualifications, the courses, the things they're spending time, effort, all of those hard things, overcoming all those barriers. And they have a desire for micro-credentials to be portable, comparable, and recognised in other jurisdictions. They want to be mobile. Irish people are particularly mobile. You all know a lot of Irish people, no doubt, where you live. And mobility is really important to us. But what enables mobility is your qualification being able to be articulated within other people's frameworks. And that's true for micro-credentials as well. If you're trying to move with your small piece of very important learning that's key to your area of work, how does an employer in another jurisdiction understand that piece of paper? Or worse, if you're in a regulated profession, how do they understand the piece of paper? And we think that the existing common language of QA and qualifications frameworks might be a really useful solution to some of those challenges. And it's really around leveraging that push to communicate our NFQs, to make our NFQs more inclusive, and to really bring micro-credentials into that ecosystem. However, we do accept that including qualifications and frameworks and having robust quality assurance systems is time-consuming, it's burdensome, it has constraints that are kind of the antithesis to this idea of flexible, dynamic, and agile. So for us, we think there is a world where we need to have tailored QA approaches, a new QA guideline. Things we're particularly concerned about is around student engagement, student feedback. We think the traditional systems do not serve micro-credentials. If someone's in a micro-credential for 6 weeks, what type of feedback do you want from that learner about their learning experience? How do you get it? Is the impact of a micro-credential measurable? When we think about graduate outcome surveys, they're really easy to say someone did a bachelor's degree and they got an employment. Those things are probably connected. Is it easy to say where someone did something for 6 weeks and something in their professional life changed? Do we know that those are related? And are we looking at the same timelines? Is it a year later? Is it 5 years later? Is it 10 years later? Things like student progression rates, retention rates, returning rates. Again, we're looking at them through longer multi-year programs. They're easy to track. What types of student data should we be tracking to be able to say things about the quality of the programs they're enrolling in? But then, on the flip side, stacking. If people want to stack something that wasn't QA'd to the same extent of what they're stacking towards, how can we be sure that they are getting a program that meets the requirements? These learners who stack something together versus the person who kind of enrolls de novo, the pieces of paper will look the same. Can we be confident of what underpins them? So things we're doing in QQI at the moment. I'm going the wrong way. So we are an awarding body. Where someone is using a micro-credential within an existing program, we have a very agile process for them to change that to a micro-credential, and it's worked pretty well, so they can piggyback on their kind of more substantive QA for micro-credentials. If they're developing a brand new micro-credential, they do go through the full quality assurance. We're reviewing the infrastructure of the NFQ, and we're going to look about how we can create an award type for micro-credentials, how that might fit in with the existing NFQ, what types of bodies might be able to make those awards. We're already opening access to our framework to new types of awarding bodies, which will be called kind of more like your alternative providers. So again, we're trying to make that NFQ more responsive, more reflexive, and more inclusive of what education and training looks like. We have a green paper on access, transfer and progression out at the moment, because access, transfer and progression has always been about traditional programs, and we're now looking at it in terms of smaller programs, smaller qualifications. And one of the key things that is in there is around credit accumulation and credit transfer. We think stacking is just another word for credit accumulation, which again has always existed. And again, information provision is really key in there, giving learners the information provision that enables them to make good, informed choices. And we have set out 3 ways we think stacking for micro-credentials could work, so that providers should plan their pathways prospectively. So if a learner takes something small, they can then see what other small things relate to it that can work together. We think there is a world where a learner navigates an education and training system in an unexpected way, but in a way that does make sense, and their groupings of small things might be coherent. They might reflect back to your National Framework of Qualifications, and then you could make a qualification from that grouping of activity, and then your more traditional RPL. We are producing a green paper on micro-credentials later this year, and it starts to unpick those ideas of why would something be a qualification versus not being a qualification, what types of QA might be more responsive to the demand-driven approach to micro-credentials, and having better principles for the validation, approval, review and monitoring. So we're starting to explore it and have these conversations with our stakeholders. So we're in a very active place of trying to define a national policy approach to micro-credentials embedded within our QA and qualifications framework systems. I do have some questions that people could use, but I'm sure you've got your own, and then that's just lots of references to show the work we've been doing. But thanks very much.